Uh, okay, you got it. I got it. Okay, so thank you for everybody. As Maxine said, we've got 3 fabulous speakers, but unfortunately Nadia isn't here at the moment. But we're kicking off with Jonathan, who is in his bio that he sent. He's a trained sound recording and audio production person who'd worked at the BBC Radio, starting in the World Service in 1986. And he began interviewing at the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive in 2016 and realised it was better to tell a story over 10 hours instead of the 3 minutes permitted on broadcast journalism, broadcast news. And he was determined to jump ship to oral history and resigned his post at the BBC to go freelance without realising he was in the middle of a lockdown, and during which he started interviewing outdoors. And some of those interviews, he says, accidentally became a podcast called Radio Walks. And although he's still not convinced that podcasts are much different to radio, he's going to talk to us about his podcast work. And unusually, I have offered to interview him on this for this event. So I'm going to ask you, welcome, Jonathan, and just to say, could you just tell us a little bit about your podcasts for anyone who hasn't heard them?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for having me, first of all, because I'm not a member of this group. I'm in the Archives SIG, which has only just started, so thank you for welcoming me. First of all, Sarah, I should say that I am an accidental podcaster. I didn't intend to make podcasts. And when I left the BBC just over a year ago, a lot of my colleagues said, "Oh, you must make podcasts." And I said, "Well, I've never even listened to a podcast. I don't know what they are." And then, because of circumstances, I found myself not getting much funding to do oral history interviewing because all the museums and archives were closed. So I started doing a broader range of work, some press and PR work. I did an interview outdoors with somebody, a farmer, in fact, or a landowner. And that was for their website, their company's website, as a sort of outreach project. I'd also, in the same week, done a training course with the NUJ with a lovely chap called Dan Mason, who some of you may know. He's an excellent trainer, and I'll send you a link, Sarah, that you can pass on to his training website. And it was about making podcasts, and it was a fantastic course. And several things came out of that. First of all, the discussion was, are podcasts the same as radio programs? I still maintain that they are. So I went into the podcasting world very much with the radio production hat on. So I'd recorded this interview outdoors, and I decided after this training course, why don't I just go through my notes, and click, 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 suddenly this interview was on Spotify. And I thought, oh, right, I better do something about this. And in the training course, Dan had said, don't make the mistake that many people make, which is they think a podcast has to be every week forever. That's unsustainable, and that's why we have ended up with billions of podcasts on the internet. He said, commit to making a one-off or a series of 4 or a series of 6. So I then decided, as I didn't have a lot of paid work to do, that I would make a series of 6 podcasts, and I called it Radio Walks because they were walk and talk interviews. And I've completed series 1 and accidentally gone on to series 2 now, which was unintentional, but there it is. So how would I describe them? Well, I originally left the BBC to move into oral history exclusively, but it hasn't worked out that way because of the circumstances of the last year or two. So I wanted to showcase oral history. I wanted to show that long-form interviewing can be interesting and entertaining and informative, but you can't really, I don't think, although a lot of people do, upload raw oral history onto the internet. It doesn't really work. You may as well be in a reading room listening to archival material. So for oral history to work on the internet, I think it has to be produced, or perhaps we could say curated. And in my world, that means radio production techniques. So I wanted it to be an interview series. I wanted it to be about the person I was walking with. And I decided that when I approached people, I would ask them to do basically a very short, a half-hour life history interview in a location that they have chosen. Now, by the end of the series, even though it's only 6 episodes, I'd kind of drifted way from that original brief, but I kept the title Radio Walks. So I aimed for 30-minute programs, because for the last 30 years I've been told, how long have I got? Oh, you've got 29:30, Julia. That'll be familiar to you. that figure, it's got to be 29 minutes 30 seconds. Or if you're doing a radio news package, you've got three or 4 minutes. And Tony will be familiar with that protocol as well. So I tried to make it 30 minutes, and for some reason they started coming out at 37 minutes. Now, I think the reason for that is because I'm no longer sitting next to someone, a colleague in the newsroom, and who I can turn to and say, can you have a look at this? And they'll say, oh, that's rubbish, cut that, move that, change that, drop that, and add this. You need a second pair of ears, really, because when you create something, you think it's great. And you need someone to tell you it isn't. So it took me to the end of the series to manage to get it down to 30 minutes. But that was my aim. It's meant to be an interview within 30 minutes that tells you something about the person I'm interviewing in the location that they've chosen.
Okay, so when you've done the walk and you've done the talk and you've got the audio that you've recorded on that occasion, can you talk me through a little bit about your process of making the podcast? How do you plan it? How do you produce it? And how do you get it to be feeling like a finished item?
Yeah, that is the difference between oral history and program making. Clearly, I go out, and the first mistake I make is I always record far too much. That's always been my mistake as a reporter. Is I come back with far too much raw material. So the first episode, I probably recorded 2.5 hours, and I had to get it down to half an hour. I've learnt on the way to try and do it what we would call in broadcasting as live, so a one-take interview. Now, it never works out like that. The main problem being that we're in an uncontrolled environment. If you're recording outdoors, you're not in a studio. In a studio, you fade up the microphone and you know exactly what it's going to sound like. Outside that's out of your control, and that was illustrated to me in the first episode was a country walk, in a country park and woodland. There were just me and the interviewee. We didn't see anyone else except sheep and birds. And the second one was a complete contrast because I recorded it in Hackney in East London, so it was a complete contrast, and I had to try and find continuity in interviewing whilst crossing roads and dodging buses and bumping into other people. There was a lot of intrusion. So the thing I'd emphasize for people who are going to do outside field recordings, literally out in the field, is record wild track, which is we're probably all used as oral historians to recording perhaps room noise, room atmos after you've done the interview or before to allow for editing. But when you're out in the field, it's really important. I can play you a clip, Sarah, of
please do.
from episode 2, which is called The Urban Gardener. Now, this person I sourced because I'd interviewed her a few years ago for the Imperial War Museum, because she was an election observer in Yugoslavia after the Civil War. So we interviewed her about that. And then I caught up with her about a year ago when I started this series, and she's become a sort of urban gardening hero. She saves green spaces in Hackney and has formed a union of about 70 or 80 gardens and green spaces. So the idea was we'd walk from the first garden she saved to other ones and see how the project had developed. But of course, it was an urban environment. I'll just play you a little bit of how it sounded. Please. You're in a hurry?
As Eric Morecambe said, you're not going to sell many ice creams going at that speed.
So we'll just let the 55 bus go past.
There's a 20 mile an hour speed limit, but I don't think that's 20 miles.
It really is quite frightening, I have to say.
Yeah, you have to have your wits about you.
Yeah, you do, don't you? How diverse was your garden community? Cordwainers, for example. You said you had... So, I mean, that just gives you a flavour of what the soundscape was like. It's very different to the controlled environment where you're doing a long-form oral history, life history maybe with someone. So the only way I was able to produce that, which means editing it basically, was to record a lot of sound that I was able to mix under to mask the cuts, mask the edits in the interview. And each episode I've produced so far has about 800 edits, individual edits in it, as well as multi-track mixing to join the bits together. So the process is approach the person and ask them for an interview. Mm-hmm. Now that will come on to a later point about consent to do that, and we can talk about that later. So approach the person, get them to agree, explain to them what you're going to do with this, and then book the date and go and get them to choose the location, and ideally do a recce first. So go along and see the location and know what the challenges are going to be. Record it, and obviously you do the usual research in advance that you do for any oral history interview. Find out a little bit about the person. I usually ask them to send me a half-page biog, or ask them what they want to talk about. Conduct the interview as best you can in those circumstances, and then the hard work really begins when you get home in the production process. So the first thing I do is I do a rough edit. So I top and tail it, and then I go through it really question by question and cut those into individual sound files. And at that point, you have a rough idea of how much you've gone over in your duration. So then you have to start cutting. You cut it, and then you have to work out how orally you are going to mix it together, get those joins put together. And I use software which many people will be familiar with called Adobe Audition, which is fairly standard. Any radio station in the world, more or less, you'll find it sitting on a desktop computer somewhere. And that really allows fantastic manipulation of sound in terms of editing and mixing. And I then will put together a rough assembly edit, which is all those individual files joined together and mixed as best I can. And then I have to look at duration again. And usually I'll be 15 minutes over, and you just have to start nibbling away at it. And that's where these 800 edits come in. You need to perhaps you need to editorially edit as well and decide, this is where you have to come in and think, actually, I'm not that great. This isn't that interesting. I'll cut that. And you have to be quite ruthless. When that's done, you have to look at the platform it's going to be on. And again, I was trained to imagine someone listening on a transistor radio in their kitchen, but now we are broadcasting in a multi-platform world. You don't know how people are listening. I'm assuming most people are listening probably on earphones with an iPhone, or at the very best on small computer speakers. So I try to bear that in mind in terms of the balance, the oral balance, and also the format. Now, most internet platforms will want MP3 file as a final edit. I use SoundCloud as my main platform, which will allow you to upload in high definition sound if you want to. But most people won't benefit from that. So I usually make a WAV mix, and then I make an MP3 mix, and then I upload it. Now, what I don't do, which people might be shocked at, is I don't send it to the interviewee first. And this comes again, Sarah, to your question about consent, which we'll talk about. I usually publish it and then wait. I do have a takedown policy. If the interviewee contacts me and says they're not happy about it, I will remove it. But that hasn't happened so far.
So why do you do it that way? Why don't you send it first and then see if they approve?
Because of the amount of work involved. I'm fitting this in between paid work, and it's extremely labour intensive. Julia, who's made radio programs for decades, will tell you, will confirm that really the ratio in broadcasting is for 1 minute of airtime, it's about an hour of production time, editing and mixing. So to produce 30 minutes of output is about 30 hours of work, which I'm self-funding and fitting in between other things. So if I send it to the interviewee and they say, oh, I'm not too happy about the bit from 10 minutes to 12 minutes, can you change this and move that around? It's like when you're working with a commercial client. Every time they ask you for a recut, you charge them another half a day to do it, right? And I'm not in a position, because I'm paying myself to do this. So I'm hoping, and so far everyone has been, delighted. To be honest with you, when you interview someone and they hear themselves produced into a package, a radio program with high production values, that sounds, it sounds nice, they're usually quite delighted, and they probably don't even pay much attention to the content. It's like, hey, I'm on the radio. If I sent it to them in advance, I would probably end up spending another 3 days recutting it until they were happy. So it's possibly, perhaps people will argue that's a little bit cheeky and unethical, but I don't think it is. So I've had their informed consent at the beginning of the process. They know what's going to happen. So that's the way I do it.
Okay. And you were talking about your audience in mind, and I know you mentioned the Radio 4 person listening on a... No, I don't know if you did mention Radio 4, but you definitely mentioned someone listening on a radio in the kitchen, and that's me. But, do you actually have a sort of people that you are beyond that thinking about aiming these podcasts at?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I mentioned the person listening on the transistor radio, I was talking in technical terms about how you balance the sound. What the listening method will be. But in terms of audience, to be honest with you, because this came about accidentally, it's not really something I thought about. It's been driven by people who've come forward and asked to be on it, and we're all familiar in oral history with this snowball effect. You interview one person and suddenly you've got a list of 30 suggestions or 30 people asking to be interviewed, and that's exactly what's happened with this. So the only thing I've got out of it, because it's costing me to make it, I'm not being hosted on a commercial platform in any way. That if you're serious about being a podcaster and you want to do it as a make a living from it, you've got to be hosted by the BBC or History Magazine or something. I'm not in that position, so I am led by whoever's coming forward. And what's happened is I've got a lot of contacts of people who've heard the podcast or heard about it, and I've from that sourced some proper oral history interviews for archives and museums as a result of doing this. So for me, it's I wanted it ideally to be a showcase for oral history, how interesting oral history can be, listening to one person's story. Now, who does that appeal to? I don't know. I think a lot of it comes down to who have I interviewed. And the audience has, from what I can tell, varied hugely depending on who I have interviewed. So the first interviewee was an 80-year-old landowner with a 1900-acre estate talking about the challenges to the farming environment, right? The second one was the urban gardener in Hackney talking about diversity amongst the population there, the challenges of the urban landscape. The third one, again, was rurally based, but talking about the challenges of road development and stuff. The next one was, the whole theme of it was about someone's ethnic identity and their life journey. And the fourth one was completely different. It was a Uruguayan film director who'd bought a boat for £1 and was sailing up the Thames estuary to make a film. And the final one in the series was a bird watcher who travels the world just to tick off birds on his list. So I think the audience is dictated by the subject matter. Now, the problem with the internet is it's vast, filled with content, and searching for something is really difficult. If I wanted to find a podcast about bird watching and I put that into a search engine, I'd get 100,000 results, I should think. So I can't really answer the question. I didn't aim for anyone in particular. And the way I distribute it, because I'm not doing this to make a living from it specifically, not yet anyway, I use a scattergun approach to distribution. So I upload it to a platform called Anchor, which has conveniently recently been purchased by Spotify, which really helps. Once it's uploaded to there, it is then pushed in all directions. It ends up on Apple Podcasts, Google Casts, various other platforms that I was unaware of because I've never listened to podcasts. And I send a group email basically to everyone I know, yourself included, Sarah, I think, saying, hey, here's the latest episode. And I assume from the sort of 400 or 500 emails I send that maybe 10% of people will click on that, and the rest will be a bit annoyed and might block me. But that's how it works. So, and that is a huge, it's not one demographic in terms of, age or gender or anything. So, yeah. It's random. I'm a random podcaster.
Well, I think it's good to be a random podcaster, and I've really enjoyed hearing how, you talking about how you went about it. I think we could talk for much longer, but I'm conscious of the time, and I'm sure if it's okay with everybody here, we'll have some questions for you and Julia and Nadia at the end, if that's okay. So thank you very much, Jonathan. So we're moving on to Julia. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Moving on to Julia, and I'm just going to read a little bit of introduce my friend Julia, who is a freelance consultant specialising in oral history and audio production. And she's an accredited trainer with the Oral History Society. It's unbelievable, but it's true. She has more than 25 years experience in audio production, including many years of working at the BBC as a reporter and producer on national and local TV and radio. So over the past couple of years, she's regularly edited podcasts on a variety of subjects, including wildlife, black theatre, dance, leadership, and museum curation. And she regularly teaches groups how to create podcasts based on oral history recordings. Welcome, Julia.
Gosh, that's really picked me up. Thank you, Sarah. God, I don't know how to live up to that. And thank you, Jonathan. It was really interesting. And we've got slightly similar sort of BBC radio backgrounds. And I think that I'd probably call myself an accidental podcaster as well. In fact, it always slightly amuses me that when I was going through my BBC training and years a while ago now, radio was a bit sort of the unloved brother of television and not very trendy, and radio programs were confined to quite a small audience, and now they're called podcasts. It's absolutely fabulously trendy, and we're right on trend, Jonathan. So so I looked at the title of the special interest group's talk tonight, which was specifically making podcasts. So I thought I'd try and talk about that, but it's really difficult to talk about making podcasts in 15 or 20 minutes. So what I've done is I've gone through 3 things that I try and get my head around before I embark on making a podcast or a radio program, whatever you want to call it. And I've slightly based this on a conversation I had with Sarah last week when she rang me up. I hope you don't mind me saying this, Sarah, to say, I've got to quote for making some podcasts and I don't know what to say. Help me, sort of thing, because I think this might be a quite familiar thing to others, that you're asked to quote to make a podcast. You're not quite sure where to start really in quoting for it. So I'm going to sort of focus on 3 things. Sarah, will I be able to share my screen in a second? Will you give me permission to do that?
Yeah, I think it's Maxine who's going to do
sorry,
that.
Maxine. Okay.
Yeah.
But before I do that and I go through my 3 things, which are fairly simple and obvious things really, and I may be preaching to the converted with this group of very experienced people, but yeah, I'm specifically going to be talking about making podcasts from oral history interviews. So usually already collected oral history interviews that have been collected as part of a project, and I often work on small scale sort of community projects, heritage lottery funded projects, education projects. So they've collected the interviews already. Or I'll be also talking about incorporating existing oral history that might be residing in an archive, because I think that happened a lot during lockdown, that museums and archives thought, we've got this fabulous stuff in here and now we can't get out and do things with people. At least we could try and use the material we've got to get it out to people. So I'll keep it focused on that, which is slightly different from Jonathan, who's going out to sort of do an oral history interview within a podcast, so to speak. Right, so before my three things, background is similar-ish to Jonathan's, in that I started working as a radio producer in 1992, I think it was, and started off in news and features, making fairly short, what we called in those days, probably still are called, radio packages, but effectively audio that you've collected, plus your voice, mixed with some maybe music and sound effects. And they got a bit longer as time went on, and I was asked to do a bit more. And in 1999, I made 16 half-hour or 29-minute, 30-second programs using just oral history content. And that was for a project called The Century Speaks. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So since then, since leaving the BBC, since doing my own thing, kind of, I've carried on using the same radio program making techniques to find different ways of sharing oral history. And I mean, I suppose the reason that I like doing this is because I get frustrated by how many oral history interviews end up in the archives and don't get listened to. So they might be used in transcript form, but they don't actually get listened to. You don't actually hear the voices. And even if you do hear some of the voices, so you've got a clip on a website or on an audio post, it's possibly, I don't know, 1-2 minutes from a 2-hour interview. So at least with podcasts or turning these into radio programs, or in the old days, CDs, it's a way of doing something a bit more with the audio, delivering a bit more of the oral history interview, perhaps in a more palatable or listenable to way, or a more creative way. And I like also that you can involve the people that you're working with, be they volunteers or students or staff, maybe in a museum setting or something, in the creative process of making those oral history interviews a bit more accessible and putting them into a sort of podcast form. Right, so that's my intro, and I'm now going to sort of go through my three considerations. So let me just see if I can share my screen. Right, can somebody nod if they can see my shared screen? Or tell me. Yeah, great, lovely. Okay, so here are my three considerations. They're a bit weird, but I will hopefully make them a bit clearer with what I say about them. So my first one is be clear about your brief. Be clear yourself and whoever you're working with, that you both know what you're talking about. And this again goes back to my conversation with Sarah last week. I'm often asked myself, and she was asked, can you quote for making a couple of podcasts? And I say, yeah, of course, happy to quote for making a couple of podcasts. What sort of podcast do you want to make? And the person who's asked me doesn't really seem to know what they're asking for. So I thought, bearing that in mind, and many of us may have been in that situation, that I'd give you three examples of the types of oral history podcasts that you might be considering, types that I have regularly make, and then decide for yourself what type of podcast might suit you or your particular project that you might have in mind for the setting that you're making for, or the audience, or whatever. So my first one I've called the top and tail section, to top and tail a section of an oral history interview. And this is a sort of simplest form of an oral history podcast that you could come across. And it basically means that you might have your presenter introducing the podcast. Maybe you could have some music at the beginning if you wanted, and then talks into the interview, which might be a life story, and it might be a section of a life story, or a shortened version of a life story. So you do your chatty introduction-y bit, and then you cut into the oral history interview. Now, you might tidy up that a bit, shorten it a bit, but there's not, hopefully, 800 edits involved. You are effectively playing your interview, but introducing it nicely, shortening it a bit, and then tailing it with a sort of back announcement, referring back to what people have just heard, and then maybe signposting to episode 2, when you might be hearing the second in the series of podcasts, which is the second of your oral history interviews that you want to get out there. So really pretty simple, straightforward to do, and doesn't take a particularly long length of time. I would suggest maybe a day, so half a day to listen to your interview and tidy it up a bit, edit it down to size, I mean, depending on how long the interview is and how complicated it is and how good quality it is or isn't, that might take longer. And then a bit of time to script your introduction and your back announcement, and maybe choose some music and then mix it together. Having said that, I say a day, but I have been doing it for a long time. If you are not familiar with audio editing software, it might take a bit longer. So I'm going to move on to my second type of oral history podcast, and I've called this narrated with clips from multiple interviews. So if a person commissioning you, or you yourself, think that you would like to do something that's more of a sort of audio compilation which involves multiple clips or montages of clips, and they're coming from multiple interviews, then this is obviously going to be a lot more time consuming. It's going to involve you listening to dozens or even more than dozens of full interviews to pick out the bits that tell the particular story you want to tell, or have an interesting theme, or bits from different interviews that fit into a theme. Then when you've sort of got that kind of rough edit of your themes, then you've got to order it, and then you've got to sort of weave your script around it. Then you start thinking about your sound effects and music, and then about mixing it all together. So this is a much, much bigger task. Even if you've got good summaries, even if you've got full transcripts, you're still going to need to go back into the original interviews and listen to the bits you've identified as working in that particular theme. Listen it to how it starts and ends, if it does tell the story you want, the editing it down. Yeah, this is where 800 or more edits come into it. So definitely it's going to take you much longer, and it's really difficult to predict or quote for making podcasts like this, particularly if you don't know the source material. So I'm going to move on to my third type, which I like, Jonathan. I'm not a huge podcast listener. I do listen to a few podcasts and different types of podcasts, but this is probably more like the types of podcasts, I don't know, that you might see regularly reviewed, where it's a bit more conversational. I would say it's sort of semi-scripted rather than totally scripted, and it's kind of as live. It's recorded, obviously, but it's recorded as if it were live, a bit like Jonathan was talking about. And you can do that with oral history, as he does, or you can do it by, for example, possibly making some new recordings. So, you know, your presenter might sort of start off on location, set the scene, talk about the project or the place, or whatever the subject matter is, then maybe introduce an interviewee who's an expert on that place or who's worked on the particular project. And then between them, they might bring up the oral histories and then cut into one. So you've now got not just your oral history clips involved, but your sort of second interviewee that you're talking to, and your as live bit that you're doing as a presenter. So I would say this type of podcast is also quite time consuming, because you might have to set up other people and go and visit your location, all the things that Jonathan talked about, and record your as live bits, and then find the relevant oral history extracts that fit around these more contextual interviews. So this is leading me to playing you my first example. So here it is. I'm going to play you a little bit of an example of one of this third type of oral history podcast, where I'm the presenter, I'm setting the scene, I'm actually standing in a field setting the scene. I bring in an interviewee, and in this case, it is a podcast about a marking gardening project, which was the Worcestershire Archives and Archaeology Department's project, and the project manager was a lady called Nina O'Hare. So we start the podcast with me setting the scene, standing in this lovely field next to what's called a hovel, and a hovel is a market gardening shed. So I'm going to cut in now to 4 minutes in, where I'm actually talking to Nina, and she is going to be the one who allows us to drop in to the oral history clips, which were collected as part of the project. Okay.
So we're going to be going inside the hovel in a minute and finding out more what they discovered in there. But before that, tell me a bit about your involvement with the wider project and particularly the oral histories.
Yes, the project started in 2018, so we've been running for a couple of years. The project's been in two parts really. One's been about the physical heritage, so the buildings that are left in the area and recording those. But we've also been recording local memories, because there's such gems of stories in there and amazing tales and lots of knowledge as well. And that's not recorded anywhere else. So that's been a really important part of this project.
I know you've listened back to all the recordings you've made for the project. Do you have any particular favourites?
Yes, I think some of the things that have stood out the most have been some of the childhood stories. Before I started this project, you think about market gardens as being run by a head of household, someone who's doing it as a profession to support their family, which of course they were, but there were so many other people involved in market gardens as well, from people who were passing through the area through to children of market gardening families.
Every weekend, Saturdays and Sundays, and all school holidays, so any time that I wasn't at school, really I went to the land with Dad. If it was the time for spring onions, then you have to first of all pull all the spring onions. So if it was nice weather, you'd sit on an upturned bushel box and you just start pulling the onions and shake off the soil and make a pile and keep moving down the piece as you were pulling the spring onions and leaving them in piles, and then you gather them up into like a crate or a box. If it was nice, you'd sit on the piece and just tie them, or if it wasn't nice, then you'd go in the shed.
So that's just a tiny bit of I think it's about 22-minute long podcast, which has got probably 9 different interviewees in it, clips from the oral histories in it, woven in amongst 3 kind of as live interviews, which put the kind of clips in context. So that's my second example. So just to go back to my first point, so the point I was making here, this is all about being clear about the brief. What sort of a podcast is wanted? And once you've worked this out, here are my 2 top tips. I recommend asking before you quote for anything to listen to a sample of the oral histories. If you haven't personally recorded it, I think that's really essential because, I mean, it could be not very well recorded and will take you a lot longer to get into shape. And also check that there are summaries, or better still, transcripts with time codes. Otherwise, it will take you forever to find your way around it. In fact, I wouldn't be able to do it without having really decent summaries with good time codes at the beginning. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to my second consideration, which is rather bizarrely called cut your coat according to your cloth. But what I mean by that is, if you've never made a podcast before and you don't have much audio editing experience or audio mixing experience, or if you're not, you may have some audio editing experience, but you're not a regular user of audio editing software, then really think about how much time you've got available to devote to this, and don't try anything too complex first off. Even if you've done quite a bit of audio editing, unless you do it regularly, it is just quite slow. And, I'm really pleased, Jonathan, that you've counted your edits. I've never counted mine, but it is hundreds and hundreds of edits. And if each one takes you a long time, that's going to be days, weeks, months to just produce one podcast. So I'm going to just go back to, it's really just an excuse for me to play almost my favourite clip of oral history ever. But I'm going to go back to the first oral history programmes or podcasts that I made, which were the ones for the Century Speaks in 1999. These 16 30-minute programmes, and they were made from 150 oral history interviews that I had collected in Herefordshire and Worcestershire. And the programmes, we were, I don't think we were forced to, but we were encouraged to put them together with no script, no narration. So the clips and the sound effects and the music had to tell the story all by themselves, which was quite a challenge and a huge amount of editing. And so I suppose I'm saying this to say not to be recommended to sort of go down that route if you don't have any programme making experience behind you. I seem to remember that we had probably about 2 weeks per programme, and even that was pretty tight for doing what we had to do. So I said it was an excuse to play my favourite clip. So I'm going to play you a little clip of the lovely Winifred. This is Winifred aged 100, and she's going to be telling you about her first experience of going to see moving pictures in 1911. 2 reasons for playing it. It's just her voice with a few sound effects. So it's showing you what you can do with no narration and just moving the story on with some sound effects. But also it's a little bit apt considering the week that we are going through. So here is Winifred.
One day, my brother came home from school. We were sitting at the table and he said, the boys at school are talking about moving pictures in the institute on Saturday afternoon. So I said, moving pictures? He said, yes. I said, oh, can we go? And he said, we'll ask Mum. So we asked my mother and she said, oh, my dears, I don't think you could see moving pictures. But if you want to go, yes, you can go. So on Saturday afternoon, we raced off to the institute and it was crowded with children. Oh, they were all on top of one another. And at last they opened the door and we went in and paid our penny. We got into about the 6th row and this fella came and stood in front and he said, now you're all going to see something this afternoon that you'll remember all the days of your life. The lights went down and the light came onto the screen and the soldiers, the guardsmen on horseback, started galloping along the front of the screen. And all these children, the boys, started shouting, they're moving, they're moving, they're moving. They were so excited, they stood up and everybody was sort of screaming and shouting. They threw the caps up in the air. And I can remember the screen and seeing the shadows of all these caps going up and coming down. And then we saw in the distance the royal coach coming. It was coming from a long distance and it very, very slowly came nearer and nearer and nearer until you could see Queen Mary and King George V sitting inside. And Queen Mary was lifting her hand up. Children were shouting, it's the Queen, it's the Queen, it's the Queen. And this coach came nearer and nearer and nearer until he got right to the very edge of the screen. And the children on the front row all got up and screamed and ran because they felt this coach was coming on top of them. You sort of didn't realise it was only a picture, really, because we'd never ever seen anything moving. And if you were out in the roadway and a carriage was coming toward you, you'd move as quickly as you could. And this really looked as if it was coming off the screen onto us.
Isn't she wonderful? So that's Winifred, and very subtle use of a few sound effects there. And I once played this during a course, and somebody very, very cocky pointed out to me that actually the film would have been silent, so it didn't need any of the sound effects anyway. So I will leave that one with you. And I am not telling you about this really quite complicated way of just using the audio to tell the story to put you off, because there's so many different types of podcasts, and it's really just to say, cut your coat according to your cloth, go for something easier, keep it simple, create a formula, stick to your formula, perhaps get some help if you want to do something more complicated, like a clever mix at the beginning or end. And actually, I have seen, and Nadia, who I hope is going to join us, is living proof of what amazing stuff can be achieved coming from no experience to start with. I hope Nadia does join us, but they set out to make 4 podcasts, and I think they ended up making 24, and they are really, really great. So yeah, cut your cloth to suit yourselves. So going on to my last point, I want to just finish sort of by talking a little bit about what I'm thinking about when making a podcast is it telling a story, and how that story needs to hold people's attention, and crucially hold people's attention right from the beginning. And like, you know, we're told in junior school, a story has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Lengthwise, I'm told that the average length of a podcast is 22 minutes. I don't know how someone's worked that out, but apparently they have. And I do think that this is quite a good length for an oral history podcast, or the type of podcasts that I make, somewhere between 20 minutes and half an hour, certainly a bit longer than that. And I think they can get quite dull. I'll try and sort of very briefly go through what I might do to create a quite simple podcast that might have 3 chunks of oral history in it, and they're sort of stitched together with my voice or somebody else's voice. So I've actually sort of drawn you a little picture. Here we go. So here's my sort of representation of what I might do. So basically, I might start it with a bit of music, or it might be a little ident with some clips in and a bit of music, and then me talking, or whoever's talking, presenting a general introduction to who I am, what the podcast is about, and then introducing the first topic, or the first bit of oral history that I'm going to play. And so there's the first bit of oral history going to be played in there. Off the back of that, it might involve just a sort of back announcement saying, and you've just heard from blah, 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 and blah, blah, talking about their memories of, and then moving in this link onto what the second sort of topic or bit of oral history is going to be about. Same thing, playing in that audio, maybe back announcing it with something that you've heard in the clips, onto the third bit of audio, then a back announcement at the end of all that, reflecting back on the whole chunk of audio that you've just been listening to, maybe mixed with a bit of music, and then a signposting to episode 2 in our podcast series if you're going to do a second one. And hey presto, you've got your podcast there and made. I don't know if that's useful or not. I think the key to all of this is being very organized and sorting out your sections first, and having everything in place before you start to sort of script and think about things like sound effects and music. So I will always sort out these chunks of audio first, what my 3 bits that I really want to focus on in this particular episode are, and then think about how I'm going to link into and out of them, and then think about my introduction and my ending. I'm going to play my final example to you, and I wanted to actually play you a podcast that was created. I did a lot of the work in it, but it was in collaboration with a group of volunteers, and this was a group of volunteers on a project who'd never done anything like this before. So they really enjoyed doing it. They had done the oral history recordings, this group of volunteers themselves, and at that point a few of them drifted off, but quite a few of them wanted to be involved in turning this material into something more shareable. So we had a go at doing podcasts, and I think they found it very rewarding. They liked being creative, they liked learning new skills, albeit just how to present well. And they liked having something at the end of the project to show for all their time that they'd spent on it, particularly doing all the interviews in the first place. So what I'm actually going to play to you is just the first couple of minutes of the first of 4 podcasts that this group of volunteers made with my help for this project. They all incorporate oral history clips from about 50 interviews that the group had done. And every single interviewee's voice was in one of the podcasts, which was something that we really wanted to do. The project was called A Forgotten Landscape. The particular part of it, the oral history, was called Tales from the Vale. Another reason for me choosing this clip was that I think it's good in that the introduction, the thing that's going to hook you right from the beginning and explain what this story is set out very clearly by the 2 volunteers' voices that you're going to hear. So I'll play you a little bit of this one.
This is an ancient landscape of salt marshes, mud banks, isolated creeks and scattered communities. It stretches from tiny Shepherdine in the north to the bustling environments of Avonmouth and Shirehampton to the south. Walking through this land, you might be forgiven for thinking that nothing has changed for generations, but in reality, much has. For 2 years, a group of volunteers has been collecting memories in order to link the Lower Severn Vales past with the present. We've recorded the voices of some 50 people as they reflect on their lives. Now we invite you to sit back and listen. You'll hear from teenagers to those in their 90s, all speaking from the heart about growing up, living and working in this forgotten landscape. You'll be guided through their stories by me, Julian Baldwin, and my fellow volunteer, Felicity Pine.
Let's start with some of the earliest memories we recorded. Accounts of growing up in villages along the Severn, where little had changed in generations. You'll hear from John Orway, Joyce Tivenham, Alfred Till and Kath Orway.
I was born in Gloucestershire, lived in Gloucestershire all my life, moved 200 yards from where I was born. That's it. Our travels going back to when I was young, sort of 4 or 5 years of age. Severn Beach was our Sunday school outing. Now that was travelling, horse and cart. Severn Beach. Then one year we went to Chepstow. But how big is the world? You know, now come on. No, Ulster's our world.
I just love the way he says there that they went to Chepstow. How big is the world? You know, it's literally just the other side of the estuary. So just even listening back to that, I can see us sitting around a table. And there was one volunteer who was very articulate, and he in fact wrote most of that introduction. And I thought he would be the one whose voice would be the best, who would be the presenter. And then we all had a go at practicing his words. And he was terrible, absolutely terrible. But another of the guys, Julian, who you heard there, who was quite a quiet chap and had done some interviewing, but had not much more, which suddenly took the lead role and presented beautifully throughout the podcast. So, you don't know what you're going to get until you dive down and find out what skills these volunteers have. So yeah, I've probably gone over my allotted slot. Gosh, I have. Sorry, Sarah. Oops. So to sum up, my 3 points were: be clear about what you're setting out to do, make sure you've got the skills to do it, and then think about the story you're telling and that it needs a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Thank you so much. That was really great, Julia, and lovely to hear some oral histories as well. Really, really interesting. And I feel like I'm ready to go to do some of my podcasts, hopefully. But I'm really sorry, but I do not think that Nadine is here unless Nadine can make herself known to us. No? Nadine, are you there? No. Or even, no, it's not here, is she? Nadia. It's Nadia. Sorry, I keep calling her Nadine, and it's Nadia. She's not here, is she?
No, I don't think she is.
Well,
Never mind.
I've been trying to email her while we've been talking this evening, and I haven't heard back. And I just hope she's okay. So I think what we'll do in the next part of this session is just to open it up to people for questions to Julia and Jonathan. If you have any questions, let us know, or put yourself on the speakerphone and let's go.
Sarah, it's Jonathan. Can I ask Julia a question? Sorry, that
Go
might
ahead,
sound a little
yeah.
bit incestuous, but I was really interested because we're doing completely different things, but using the same methodology in a way. In that we're producing radio programs, really, aren't we? And that's always been. In fact, it's a discussion I think I had with Tony when I met him at the who seems to have disappeared. I think when I met him at the Oral History Conference years ago, and it was what's the difference between a podcast and a radio program? And I've always said, well, a podcast is a radio program on the internet, and some people said no, it's a completely different genre. But I think in the way it's made, it isn't. But the difference for us is what I wanted to talk about really was consent, because when I go and do my podcast, because I'm doing it in a sort of broadcasting way, the informed consent is quite simple. There's no forms to sign. It's you tell someone why you're doing it, they know you're recording them, and that's it. You publish it. But you're using archived oral history. So I'm wondering what implications that has for consent, because all I do is stick to the Ofcom broadcasting code, because I feel if I'm making something for the internet, I'm broadcasting, I'm not archiving. So do you just stick to the 1996 Broadcasting Act in terms of consent, or is it more complicated for them because of the material you're using?
I think it's easier actually, because all the material that I'm using already has consent through the oral history consent forms that we've used, which will be these days the participation form that you do pre-interview covering GDPR and personal data, and the copyright form afterwards, in which it specifically sets out what it could be used for, and that will include broadcasting / podcasting. You can always go back to the people whose voices are going to be included and say, oh, and by the way, there's a podcast coming out, but I don't think you need to ask consent again, because it's already covered in what they've already signed up to.
But once you've published it on the internet, and that's what we're talking about, it's publication, do you publish it under Creative Commons, non-derivatives, non-commercial? Because, of course, if someone takes your material in fair usage, doesn't apply like it would in broadcasting. So how do you cover yourself with that?
Well, so most of the projects that I've worked on have been lottery funded ones, and lottery funded projects have it's a condition of getting your funding that anything that you publish is under a Creative Commons license. So yeah, that's how it's shared through the internet.
Yeah, Pam's got her hand raised. Pam, do you have a question?
Yes, actually, it's partly been answered by what Julia just said, but I'm still slightly unclear what a podcast is and what the difference is between a podcast and an edited broadcast program, other than the means of transmission, i.e. through the BBC or some other broadcasting organisation which chooses it, maybe commissions it and chooses it and takes responsibility for it. And a podcast, which, from what I understood from what Jonathan was saying, is sort of only in the ether, and it's God's own luck where it lands and who accesses it. I wonder if you could just make clear for us a bit more what the difference is between a complete radio broadcast of, say, half an hour on a topic, and a podcast.
Can I speak on that?
Can I answer that?
Oh, sorry.
Can I butt in there briefly?
Yeah.
That's probably bad, isn't it? Well, could I say, and then you can both, Julia and Jonathan, you can say if you agree. What do you think about that? Would you say that there is a lot of similarities, but perhaps that you are the author, which is similar to radio, but that, as you say, where it goes, who's going to listen to it? People come up from many different directions. It doesn't just have one choice. People come out from different ways, and that perhaps that gives you the freedom, perhaps a bit more creative freedom, to create something a bit more personal. You've got more invested in it, I would say, to speak to people, and the people that you're making it with as well, they can take ownership of it. So I think it's something to do with ownership, that you're not making it for the BBC or for Channel 4, whoever that may be, that it's a little bit more ambiguous about the ownership, which perhaps that makes it a bit more, I was trying to think of the word, I can't think of the word. Anyway, made for lots of people. What do you think about that, Julia?
I think that it's a bit like trying to define oral history. It's a different thing to each different person. And yes, it's, could be transmitted in a different way. It might have a different approach about it. I mean, a lot of podcasts are just three people chatting round a table with a microphone in the middle. That's the kind of podcast my daughter listens to. I define it as an audio compilation that's getting out there somehow. And I just think it's a fantastic way of delivering pre-existing oral history or audio material that's sat there in archives, not getting out there. So I'm not really answering the question, Pam, because I think that we could spend probably an entire day debating what a podcast is, but that's how I define it to myself. And I think it's fantastically liberating, because people are finding audio about subject matter that they're interested in because of the way it's now broadcast via so many different platforms.
That was my second question, actually, was how do we, if we want to know more about what a podcast is and listen to some, how do we access podcasts?
Well, I can send you a link to mine. Yeah, I mean, just going back to the first point, in my mind, and it's probably because I've spent my entire life making radio programs and broadcasting. So to me, it is just the current way of broadcasting. The internet is really probably the biggest broadcast platform we have now. I was quite surprised to be told while I was still at the BBC that I am old-fashioned, I'm a dinosaur, because I will look in the Radio Times and see that there's an interesting programme on Radio 3 at 8 o'clock in the evening, and I will tune in and listen to it live in real time. Most people, I'm told, especially people under the age of 30, do not do that now. They want programming on demand, which is why it's called POD, P-O-D, Programme on Demand. You download it and listen when you want. When you're walking the dog, when you're doing something else, you can stop it and start it. So I regard the internet as a broadcasting platform. The problem with it is so vast that my podcast, I acknowledge, is a needle in the haystack broadcasting. You know, the chances of anyone finding it, no matter how clever search engines are, and no matter how hard I promote it, it's a very slim chance that someone will just find it unless you tell them to look for it. So it's narrow casting in a way on a broadcast platform. And to answer your specific question, Pam, you need to use the internet. Obviously, you need to look at a podcast hosting platform. There are huge ones like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and there are smaller ones. And it's as simple as clicking on a link and using the playback software on your device, whether it's a laptop or an iPhone or whatever, to listen to that audio. But at the end of the day, I am making radio programs, and they happen to be broadcast over the internet. I'd love them to be broadcast over the radio waves, over the air on the BBC, but that's never going to happen. It's, as Julia said, we could spend an entire conference discussing the difference between podcasts and radio programs.
Oh, well,
we haven't got time.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions before we come to a close for this evening? We have a little meeting for members to come to if they want to at the end.
Someone was asking about equipment, Sarah. I don't know whether that was.
Yeah, I saw that, and there was a response from Julia. But Jonathan,
right.
tell us about your equipment, please do.
Well, I'm using. I mean, as I said, most of my career I was stuck in a studio where you know exactly what the equipment's going to do. But recording outdoors, I had to go back to my sort of outside broadcast experience. And the great thing now is that equipment is so light, so portable, and will run on batteries, that it's much easier to do. And I've really honed down my equipment. To do the main interview, I use radio mics like this, which are made by Rode. It's got a transmitter and a microphone built in. And then I usually use a multi-track recorder. This is the smallest one I've found that's multi-track. And they're not very expensive. They're a couple of £100. The advantage of using a multi-track recorder, if you think, oh, well, you're just interviewing one person, but things happen during the recording, during the interview, that you want to capture. So I use a third track on the recorder, so they're all synchronized with a handheld microphone like this, and you need a good lot of wind shielding if you're working outside. And that allows you to capture ad hoc stuff. I mean, I was doing one episode and suddenly we came across some buskers in the street. So we recorded them and interviewed them on the third track without losing the two main interview tracks. So relatively cheap, lightweight equipment. If you use it, practice with it and use it properly, it will get you broadcast quality recordings. In terms of post-production, as Julia said, don't bite off more than you can chew. I know a lot of people, a lot of oral historians use Audacity. Well, it's free, but I lost the will to live after about 5 minutes with Audacity, and I pay the $20 a month subscription to Adobe Audition because I've always used it, and it does everything you could ever want it to do in audio terms. But you do really need training and you need practice. You really do. If I hadn't spent my entire career making radio programs, I don't think I'd now say, oh, I'm going to make podcasts, because it is quite challenging if you want to make them with good production values. The problem with podcasts, and the reason I don't listen to many, is because most of them are terrible. They're really badly produced. And I'd rather listen to real radio programs on the radio. But I'm probably a snob. I'm sure I am. So there we are.
Okay, there was a question from Simon that came up in the group chat. Simon, do you want to ask your question?
Hello. Yeah, it's been fascinating. Thank you very much. It's been great. This is going to come out in a sort of tumbling out my mouth rather than the particularly well formed, but the thoughts on sound effects and music. One on the emotional transition or changes or influence that sound effects can have, and music, and the thoughts on that. And two, I mean, that you're talking about, you spending your life in broadcast, both of you, knowing what effects to use and when. I can see just being, just 5-10 years worth of study is incredibly hard. Question part 3, where do you source the audio and the music from? Thank you.
Shall I start? So, yeah, I agree with you, Simon. It's really sort of a bit nuanced where and when you use sound effects and music, particularly with pre-existing oral history recordings, because sometimes you can actually detract from them, from the very thing you're trying to do, which is to get the oral history voice that, we're all involved in oral history, and we probably do it because we just love hearing the way people speak. And sometimes you can spoil that by sticking sound effects on it. In fact, I did make a podcast with a group recently, and I put sound effects on it, and it just did not sound right. So I took them all off again afterwards, and it is just the voices linked on that particular one. So gathering sound effects and where you get them from, I often find the best way is to simply make them yourself, because a lot of it is quite sort of subtle stuff, so like background to give an atmosphere, like standing in a field. So collecting the dawn chorus on a quiet day in my own garden, that kind of thing, or standing by the side of the road and getting the sound of a car going past, or a car door slamming, or whatever it might be. There are lots of websites, in fact, hundreds of websites, probably thousands of websites, which offer free sound effects and even copyright-free music, which you can look at. Some of them are terrible, some of them are useful, and other ways is that you sign up to pay for bits of music that are appropriate, or you get someone to get someone to compose music that fits the bill for your particular podcast, which might sound like a really expensive option, but isn't often. It's often better than spending hours looking for appropriate music and then paying for it per piece of music. Because there are musicians out there who are amateurs, do it, for fun and as a hobby, who'd be delighted to compose a little theme tune with a couple of major and minor variations that pull your whole thing together really nicely.
Thanks,
Jonathan, you're muted.
Sorry, I was banging.
Sorry, I was muted. That's not very good for a sound engineer, is it? I was going to say I would recommend the site. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say I'd recommend a site called Free Tools for Journalists, which again Dan Mason, the training chap at the NEJ, came up with. It's full of, his philosophy is if it's free, use it. Music is a real problem on internet publication, because you do need to pay rights. So there's a lot of people stealing intellectual property rights. by stealing music and using music, but there are sites that will provide free music. And if you, like me, have a subscription to Adobe Audition, they have an entire library of non-needle time music that you can use. Personally, I haven't really used music in any of the podcasts. And also, going back to what Julia was talking about, when you're producing a radio program, I really love not having my voice in it if I can avoid it. And if I can avoid making links, if I can link the story, the narrative, with the sound on its own, with the interviewee and the sound that you've recorded in the field alone, I always feel I failed if I have to read a link into it to join two bits together. And in the last one, I had to do 2 links to explain it. So if you can avoid adding artificial, non-synchronous effects and unnecessary music and let the story tell itself in voice, I think it's stronger for it. And I'll always stick to Alastair Cook's philosophy that the pictures are better on radio. You can tell a story in audio only. You don't need oral pictures, really. You don't need music and effects, in my view. If you can help it, don't do it.
Thank you, Jonathan. Craig's had his hand up for a little while. Craig, would you like a question?
Sure. There are a couple of things. One that's just emerged from this last conversation. If you're a member of the Creative Oral History Special Interest Group and you join the group's IO, the email discussion group, there are a lot of these things which could be raised there, and a lot of information that could be shared there, links and so on. Very useful way of using that particular toolkit. But the reason why my original hand went up, really going back to Jonathan and his approach to consent and so on, and even the word consent, which I have real difficulties with. I know nothing about the broadcasting legislation, so I don't know how things fit in that world. But from an archivist and from an oral historian's point of view, and just the engagement with GDPR, I have a lot of questions. One of them is about informed consent before there is something to consent to. So getting informed consent before you have a program, what is someone consenting to? So that's an issue. Another issue is with the word consent itself. In GDPR terms, there is a lawful basis of consent, which creates all kinds of problems if you employ it. You want to do everything you can to avoid using consent as a lawful basis, and any way that you can avoid any confusion around that is good. I mean, there's a long conversation could be had around that because consent is such an interesting concept.